Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance and the convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network. I'm glad to host you today for this webinar on the using private capital for social change and the dangers of privatization that come with that. Something that in some way we have already started exploring through many of our prior sessions, but we've never quite looked at it as systemically as we will do today. Honored to be joined by Donald Cohen and Shar Habibi from In the Public Interest, which has long been our reference point at Transform Finance for anything having to do with issues around privatization. And even though Donald and Shar don't take explicitly a finance-centric approach, today we'll try to dive with them a little bit into both the broader issues around privatization, but also the specific explicit role of private capital in driving or not driving privatization. Now, why is this a concern and how does it fit with what we have been exploring so far? You know that one of the usual questions that we ask at Transform Finance is who benefits, or as our board chair, Aner Ben-Ami, puts it, are we redefining who wins and who loses through the investments that we make? And there is a clear sense in which the very activity of impact investing or investing for social change means that those who are in a position of ownership of assets get to act in furtherance of a certain vision of the world that they aspire to, which is a good thing, which drives all our work, but has an underlying issue that I do want to dive into today around, well, who gave us the mandate to do so, right? We have our own idea of what the world should look like, but so have the Koch brothers, and so have a lot of other folks whose values we might disagree with. And there is so an intrinsic tension around accountability, around the democratic or undemocratic process of allocating capital towards a certain vision. And we need to wrestle with that a little bit. And I want to see how that how the work that In the Public Interest has been doing for so many years can help us a little bit rethink our work. And this goes both for the cases in which privatization does not go well, actually creates some negative consequences, whether they are unexpected and unintended or something that was kind of predictable, as we will see in some of the examples. But even when it goes well, and just as a quick anecdote, I teach a class at NYU called The Intersection of Finance and Social Justice, where most of the students are generally well attuned to these issues. And I teach every year, and this year for the first time, when I try to bring up the issue of interference with what was historically a public function or a function of the government, I actually got some pushback from the students. It was the first time that it happened where, as I said to them, you know, who gives the right, say, to Bill Gates to decide what the what the educational system in Liberia should look like, or who gave the right to certain CEOs to determine whether assault rifles should be sold or not. Shouldn't that be something that is decided by a public function or via a public function, and therefore have some accountability? For the first time this year, I heard, no, actually, we are okay, said the students, with the private sector making that sort of decisions. And I found that scary. I found it concerning, and I hope it was a bit of a blip on the radar and not really a new generation really giving up on the role of the public sector. But if we think of impact investing and finance for social change, generally as an effort to complement, let's say, what could historically be deemed a public function, complementing it as opposed to replacing it. We're now going to turn to hearing from Shar and from Donald about what they think we should be mindful of, what we should keep front of mind, and they will have some concrete considerations and actual questions that can help us sort of diligence our own effect on privatization. I encourage you to chime in. You can do so through the chat function, or at the end of their presentations, you can unmute yourselves, and there will be some time for discussion towards the end. So with that, I welcome Shar to get us started with this. Shar, thank you so much for joining us today. I will pass the controls to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today, and we're very excited to talk with you today. So first, I think I just wanted to talk about what is privatization and make sure that we're talking about the same thing and using at least some similar vocabulary on this call. The way that we define privatization is as follows. So basically, privatization, you may have heard it referred to as outsourcing or contracting out or a public-private partnership. But ultimately, it's removing a public good, a public service, a public asset from public democratic control and placing it under private control by a corporation or other private entity. So while the specifics of the privatization deals vary, not all of them look exactly alike, what makes the difference is who controls the public good, service, or asset. And I just want to make a note that some privatization schemes have a particular reliance on private capital, and we'll focus on some of those sectors for the purposes of this presentation. Okay, and you know what, I'm just having, there we go. Okay, so big picture considerations on the intersection of private capital and privatization. Just some big things, big picture questions to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we're going through some of the more nitty-gritty content. So private capital inserts private interests into public services. So what are the potential problems with that? What are the broader social, economic, environmental, kind of et cetera, consequences? And then is there a way to balance the need to earn a return on investment with ensuring that the public service or public asset meets the needs of the public, meets the needs of the community? And then just a super kind of, let's just zoom out even more, just a even bigger picture question is, does privatization give private interests power over public decisions that could weaken support for public goods or kind of erode, erode our support for public? And that kind of dovetails with what Andrea was saying about kind of what his class was telling him. But I think there's this big picture question around, weakening our support for public provision and also public policy making and just public generally. And I'm so sorry, I'm still having a problem with there we go, thank you. So I'm gonna turn it over to Donald.
All right, you can hear me now, right? Okay, good. We're just chatting about who's going to advance the slide, sorry, on the sideways because we're having technical issues. So first I want to give the picture on public goods. Now, from our perspective, we think about public goods a little bit more colloquially than, say, I don't know if there are any economists on the call. Economists talk very specifically about public goods as being exclusionary and non-rivalrous. We don't talk about it that way. We think about public goods in a more expansive way that are things we decide are public responsibility, that are accessible to all, that create conditions for a healthy democracy, a healthy economy, sustainable knowledge, safety, shared knowledge. So we think about public goods in that sense. What are public responsibilities? Go ahead. I'm just going to go through a few that we think of, what we're going to be talking about in more depth later on in the slideshow. So infrastructure, we think is obviously is a public good. We see lots of, in the wake of, the two things. One is we have a massive infrastructure deficit in the country, several $1 trillion of water systems and bridges and roads that are, in need of repair. Not to mention, new infrastructure that we may want to build, such as, municipal broadband or other things. And given the reluctance in many places to raise taxes and raise revenues to do those, there's an increasing interest of by the part of both agencies, mayors and governors and transit agencies and the like, and investors to invest and create public-private partnerships that involve both the financing of front-end financing with private financing often, but also the operations and maintenance and multi-sector deals. So this is sort of one of the areas that we see a lot, we deal with a lot. Go ahead. The next is we're seeing a fair amount of private investment or private interest in charter schools. In particular, and I should say we're not against charters or for charters. We see the growth of charters as potentially privatizing public education as a whole, given the density and the increasing density. So the particular issue we see a lot is in the financing of facilities. There's a number of states that have different state statutes and financing programs to finance the construction or the purchase of new facilities that are different from public schools. And so there are both private entities, the Turner Agassi Fund, and lots of nonprofit, financing entities that are building, helping to build and finance the construction and purchase of private schools, in addition to lots of public programs. But we, regardless of whether it's a charter or a public, we think education of the entire population is, we consider charter schools public schools. They're publicly funded, and they're part of the system of what will create a good education system for every kid and every family.
And I will chime in there quickly, Donald, just to point out that there is a lot of charter school funding that comes from impact investors, including many that we're fairly well aligned with. And we thought this would be a very interesting example to lift up because from the movement angle, from the social justice advocate and activist perspective, we hear a lot of complaints around charter schools, and we haven't seen a very thorough analysis again of well, what is it about our investments in charter schools that makes them good or not. So I completely share with you the view that we're not either for or against public schools, but we want to be a bit more mindful both. Charter schools. We want to be a bit more mindful both of the concerns around specific investments that and the parameters for what would make a good charter school investment that are coming up from the school reform activist side, and also this broader consideration, which I think is at the heart of what you and Shar are touching on. Well, what does it do to the educational system as a whole? How does it impact public resources in general? So that's definitely a prime example for this. Thanks.
Yeah, and you don't have to go backwards, but one thing we spend a lot of time people ask us, are you for charters, against charters? And we spend a lot of time saying that's really an irrelevant question. It's, what do you need to do to make every school good? And, we can get into more detail of that later. We're also seeing, and some of your impact investors may be involved in these as well, public pay for success that are also referred to as social impact bonds, where for social services like homelessness or reducing recidivism in the criminal justice system, for pre-K, education, childcare, and education. So a whole set of social services. I sit on I was appointed by Senator Schumer to sit on a federal advisory panel to advise the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, on how to basically give away about $90 million that was appropriated in the 2018 federal budget. That as this the federal government's sort of first test of the model of pay for success. And so we've done our first notice of funding availability. We've made our recommendations. That's still in the process right now. There'll be another cycle to give away the rest of the money. So we've learned quite a bit about both the good programs that are being funded and the potential issues that come from that. Again, we'll talk about that later. But we think the safety net is a public good. Everybody needs to have access to the basics. Go ahead. And then finally, public goods, corrections and immigration. It's public safety, it's corrections, it's immigration. These are big issues. And the particular issue we see that relates here is that the two primary, the largest private prison companies, Geo Group and what used to be CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, now called Core Civic, have converted to real estate investment trusts and are increasingly interested in the purchase and the construction and the ownership of new facilities, of existing facilities and new facilities. And so, and anyway, so that's a particular area that we think. We're not a big fan of private prisons in terms of contracting. I think it's the one area we think where, we just don't think there's a role for private prisons fundamentally. That's not true in other sectors. And so, and probably a number of you have probably been involved in some of those efforts to use your investments. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. I don't think private prisons are something that many folks on the call are very keen to invest in. But through this analysis, I think we can also look at some of the alternatives to incarceration that have been coming up, such as monitoring ankle bracelets and the like, which are largely privatized and I think are equally problematic in some ways.
Exactly. Okay. Go ahead, Chair. I'm going to give it back.
Okay. So back to me. So one of the ways that we look at this issue is through kind of hard questions to ask. So when we are advising policymakers or advocates, we have a document called Questions to Ask, and it's asking hard questions about these deals. And I think this frame very much applies to you all as well. When you are, when you're faced with some, from some marketing materials or whatever you're looking at, how do you ask the right questions, the hard questions to dive deeper and really understand the implications of the deal? And so there's a link there. We will definitely put it in the chat box as well. And on the next slide, so this is what the actual document looks like on our website. There's 10 questions. Some of them are a little cheeky, but it gets at some really fundamental issues in privatization. I'm going to go through several of these that I think are most relevant to our discussion today, but I encourage you to take a look at the full document as well. Okay, so the first question is, does the contract limit our democratic rights? One important consideration in these deals is the balance of the public interest and investor interest. And this is a particular issue around infrastructure. So for infrastructure to truly work, the government must maintain enough control over it to ensure it continuously meets the needs of the community. But one big issue that we're concerned about and that we've seen is the loss of public control when we privatize critical infrastructure. So we've analyzed a number of these contracts, and we have found provisions such as non-compete clauses and compensation clauses that limit the ability of policymakers and city planners to make decisions regarding their cities, decisions that could improve their cities, to build new infrastructure, to combat climate change. And because these contracts last for decades, sometimes between 30 and 50 years, although we've seen 75 years, 99 years, these are impacts, these contract clauses could have impacts that, last for generations. Next slide, thank you. So one example that illustrates this really well, and that I'm sure some of you on this call know about, is the Chicago parking meters privatization effort. And you probably know about it because it's like literally Exhibit A on exactly how not to structure a contract. You know, and it's in 2008, the city of Chicago signed a 75-year contract with a consortium of companies to run the city's 36,000 parking meters. And the contract included a compensation clause that requires the city to pay financial penalties if the private entity, you know, to the private entity, if they have to, if certain events occur that threaten their profits. So for example, if the city wants to shut down a few streets for a street fair, they have to pay the private, you know, the private entity. If they want to add a couple of handicap parking spots, they have to pay the private entity for how much revenue they would have gotten off of those spots for the lifetime of the contract, meaning set for 75 years. We worked with a professor in the Chicago area who interviewed transit planners and found that this contract was actually limiting their ability to do things like bus rapid transit and add bus lanes. And this is for the life of the next, you know, for a 75-year contract term. And so these types of clauses have proved really expensive for taxpayers, because there's been times where they've needed to use that space, or they've needed to use those parking spaces. And so in 2016, payments to the private entity for directly related to these compensation clauses were $15.7 million. In 2017, they increased to $21.7 million. So this is a lot of money that the city is having to pay due to these types of clauses, and they significantly hold, you know, policymakers, city planners' hands behind their back. I'm going to mention one other thing that I think will be interesting to you guys, is that when Chicago privatized this, they gave up decades of revenue that they really, you know, that they really needed. A 2018 audit showed that Chicago's parking meter system raked in $134.2 million in 2017. And that is putting private investors on pace to recoup their entire $1.16 billion investment by 2021. So that's like 2 years from now. That leaves them with 62 years of kind of pure profits because they've recouped their investment.
Let me, and I'm going to add a couple of points on the Chicago parking meters. So one is, you know, parking rates went way up real fast. So everybody in Chicago is quite upset. But we get a lot of the question, it's a terrible deal. Everyone involved in infrastructure knows it's a terrible deal. So and very few will, cities or other places will do a deal this badly. I mean, everyone sort of agrees. The reason we use it as an example, though, is because the features of this deal are actually common. The non-compete clauses, the compensation clauses, and things like that. So there are features that, even for, you know, much more well-designed P3s, that, you know, that show up again as well. Yeah,
that's correct.
And I will add one quick thing on the democratic rights limitation here, because even if we leave aside the economic interest piece and just how much the private ownership will profit from this by using something that is, again, essentially a public space, what Shar raised about the timeline is crazy, right? One of our democratic rights is the right to change our mind and to have different priorities over time, whether it be bike lanes, bus lanes, and the like. And if I'm understanding this correctly, the contract blocks us from the freedom to change our mind and to decide that we want more bus lanes or we want more street fairs in the future, and no matter how that change happens, it will have to be compensated.
Yeah, and so to put a finer point on that, think about public policy that this could impact: land use, housing, climate, transit. I mean, commerce. How we, just how we define things. So the impacts are really pretty profound, and we may not even be driving for that long. Okay.
Yeah, I think one thing you say, Donald, is what did transportation look like 75 years ago, and what does it look like today? What do we think it's going to look like 75 years from now? And we're limited in the way that we can change the way that we use our streets in Chicago. So it's a big deal. So another question, really important question to ask is, are there perverse incentives that work against public policy goals? I'll give a few examples to illustrate this point. I think the easiest example is prison bed guarantees. We did a report, I think it was back in 2015, where we analyzed a very large sample of state level prison privatization contracts. And what we found was that almost 70% of them contained bed guarantee clauses. So basically it was 75%, 85%, 95%, and in Arizona, I think there's a couple contracts that had 99%. It's either you keep these beds filled, or you, government, will have to pay us, private companies, for these empty beds. And you can see how that definitely incentivizes governments to keep these beds filled, or else they're going to have to pay for these empty beds. And really can be an impediment toward things like sentencing reform and other good public policies that a governmental entity may want to implement. Another example are if you're in the DC area, you may be familiar with the express beltway lanes. And in this contract, there are some environmental impacts. So there is a long-term contract between Virginia and the consortium of companies. And basically, this contract penalizes the state for increased carpooling on its high occupancy express toll lanes around the Capitol Beltway. And so the state wanted to encourage carpooling by allowing carpoolers to use the express lanes for free. But the contract penalizes the state if too many carpoolers use those lanes because it would adversely affect contractor revenues. Even though carpooling accomplishes, important public goals such as reducing congestion, reducing pollution, basically for the next 40 years, the contract requires Virginia to reimburse the private companies whenever Capitol Beltway carpoolers exceed 24% of the traffic, or until the private consortium makes $100 million in profit. So that has a very clear environmental connection and impact. And then lastly, I just want to touch on the pay for success social impact bonds. I think that measuring outcomes in these deals is a little harder than is typically acknowledged. And governments and stakeholders have to be really careful that the measurement tools can demonstrate a causal link between the intervention and the outcomes of that intervention. And there are potential, not to say that this happens all the time, but that there are potential disincentives to do things like serve the neediest populations, which is, can be referred to as creaming or cherry picking, or avoiding the treatment of harder to help clients, which is referred to as parking. And there's some other strategies, and really these are strategies that can make the intervention more likely to succeed and hit benchmarks, but it could be at the expense of the broader group who needs assistance and not really totally telling about the efficacy of the intervention itself. So just some things to consider in terms of looking really deeply at the arrangement.
And then let me add
next slide, please.
Yeah, and let me, you don't have to go back. Let me add a word or two on social impact bonds. And this is just, you can follow up later, because I learned a ton by being on this federal commission over the last year at Treasury. So if folks we can get into a more detailed discussion later. The programs we all funded were I think, all really good. I voted yes on all of them, but there are distortions and some of the tunnel vision. So if folks are involved in that stuff, we'd be happy to follow up with you to sort of, go into the weeds a little bit more on what we learned.
One more thing on that, as I think about the incentives in terms of creaming or cherry picking, some of them are on the part of the investor, right? The financier of the intervention. But you can also think of the government, the public entity that is requesting this social impact bond. If they were to be successful at scale, if a lot of capital was flowing that way, I could see the public entity prioritizing interventions that are likely to attract capital for a variety of reasons, as opposed to the ones that would be done if the capital piece was not part of the consideration.
Absolutely, that may even be more of the driving dynamic, because in the grants that we just are, recommended, the lead agency were all governments, and so it's not it's a function of the model, which has investment in it, but also public purpose as well and public involvement.
So one more example that I wanted to just dig a little deeper into, we brought up the subject of charter schools earlier on and wanted to just put a little finer point on that. We did a report last year. You can see you see the cover of the report on the screen. And basically what we found was that too many charter schools can drain public school district budgets, taking resources from neighborhood school students. And so there's a growing body of research that shows that in many states, school districts and the students that they serve are undermined by the prioritization of opening new charter schools. So when a student leaves a neighborhood school for a charter school, their prorated share of funding also leaves with them. And the district remains responsible for a lot of the costs that those funds would have supported. There's a lot of fixed costs that this district still has, even if some students leave and take their share of funding with them. And so this really intensifies fiscal pressures at the neighborhood schools to cut core services like counseling and libraries, special education, increase class size, and could even put these schools at risk for closure. So for example, we found that California's charter school growth, which has been pretty dramatic in recent years, cost San Diego School District $65.9 million during the 2016-2017 school year. That's a lot of money. And so beyond the issues that at the particular charter school, inside of the actual charter school, if we just step back, we can see that kind of a rapid increase in charter schools in an area can damage or lessen the quality of and eventually kill off schools within the traditional public school system. So I think it's kind of a more macro point about there's limited dollars, and charter schools could be perpetuating some of the issues that we see, some of the issues at traditional public schools, neighborhood schools.
And then let me add one other thing. Am I off mute? Yeah. Again, for more discussion, this is, getting past the binary. There are some great charter schools and great public schools, bad charter schools, bad public schools. That's not the issue at all. But I haven't been involved in this in a while. The competitive model that charter schools, the original idea of charter schools was to create laboratories of innovation where we learn things and get shared so every student and every school can benefit. But it's become very different. It's become a competitive system where charter schools don't want to share, actually, because it's, they're competing for, students and resources to fill their schools. And so distortions happen from that competitive model, creaming and cropping. There will be curriculum. There are some charter schools that say their curriculum are trade secrets. So quite counter to the want to share. So it's we believe that like I said earlier, we should have charter schools that where we learn things, but we should make sure that that's, everyone's on a level playing field. We're not defunding the existing schools, but we're also sharing everything we learn so every kid can benefit. So there's an issue of the fundamental, rubric that we address all the time at a practical level.
So the next question is around transparency. Will we still have the right to know? And this is pretty simple. When something is privatized, it may not be subject to open records laws, open meeting laws that the service or asset would be subject to if it were still in the public realm. And so it's taking away the public's access to key information. And I'll give you a couple of examples on the next slide. So in Texas, there was a privatized road, a public-private partnership for State Highway 130. And it was a deal with a developer that ended up having to file bankruptcy when the revenue projections failed to materialize. And the private consortium refused to release any details around those traffic projections that the project was based on, claiming that that was proprietary information. But people were, there were a number of groups and folks that were, and journalists that were really interested in kind of understanding how this went so wrong. And unfortunately, the Texas Attorney General agreed and said, actually, they are not subject to our, to our state's open records laws. So it was kept proprietary. In the education world, we saw just this year in the DC area, the Cesar Chavez Public Charter School Network. It's one of the oldest charter school networks in DC. And they announced that they were going to close one of their school campuses at the end of the year. And some of the parents found out about this like by watching the news, turning on the news in the evening and finding out that their school had made an announcement that they were going to close. And the school community was left in the dark because they did not have open board meetings. The board meetings were not open to the public. Parents could not go and learn that the school was actually having financial problems. So that's another instance of where this lack of transparency directly hurt the families that the school was serving. Okay, so next question. Will the outsourced jobs have family supporting wages and benefits? What we have seen is that promised cost savings, one of the ways that these cost savings come from is reduced wages and benefits for workers. And there has been some recent research that shows that this disproportionately impacts African American workers. Public sector jobs have been an important source of employment for African American workers. They are 30% more likely than non-African Americans to work in the public sector. Public sector jobs have always had strong equal opportunity requirements, higher rates of unionization, more enforcement of anti-discrimination laws than the private sector. So these jobs have really been an important ladder for African Americans into the middle class. And there's research that shows that African American public sector workers earn 25% more than other Black workers, both men and women, than other industries. And so you can see that due to their prevalence in public sector jobs, African American workers are more likely to be affected when jobs are contracted out to companies that pay reduced wages and benefits. And then also just this idea of what are the broader community impacts. There was some research a few years ago out of the University of Colorado that showed that reducing wages and benefits has real consequences for local economies. So declines in wages means that workers have less money to spend in their communities. Lower wages means that local and state governments are collecting less in sales tax, income tax, property tax. I mean, basically, less money flows into the local economy. More money is routed to, to corporations. So that's an impact that we see. And we see this in a couple of different situations. One is actually right now, kind of currently that's going on in DC. There's been some strikes in the between workers who are working for a company called TransDev, which is contracting with WMATA, the transit agency in the DC area. And those workers those bus drivers are getting paid $12 less on average than the public sector WMATA workers that are driving very, very similar routes. And so there's a huge differential in terms of wages and also benefits. They've recently cut health benefits. The company has recently cut health benefits. So there's been a lot of coverage of this in the DC area, and some strikes have happened as a result. And then we kind of saw the same dynamic in the Chicago Skyway that was privatized using a P3 model. And those cost savings were largely derived from reduced labor costs as well. So city workers who had maintained the road were paid starting point $20 an hour. After it was privatized, they were paid between $12 and $15 an hour. So again, big wage differentials.
And I imagine that one could say there, perhaps not among the folks on this call, that they were being paid too much in the first place, right? So this would be part of the efficiency argument in favor of privatization. If I'm understanding you correctly, part of the concern is then that, again, the decision as to the quality of those jobs is not part of the kind of public decision making around around governmental jobs, but is privatized, and generally it's made from the perspective of the pure profit motive of whoever is now making the decision as to how much to pay the drivers or others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Okay, so just a couple more of these big questions to get through. I know this has just been a lot of information, but are there limits on the contractor's ability to raise fees, tolls, or rates? So user fees, and again, we're really talking about infrastructure when we're talking about user fees, because typically that's where we're seeing, tolls or, your water bill, things like that. There's user fees associated with a lot of infrastructure. So user fees often increase under a privatization scheme. The contract may give the contractor a lot of latitude in setting rate changes. And these schemes can really create impediments to affordability schemes. There may be less incentive to create kind of robust affordability schemes for people who can't afford the infrastructure. There were some, let's see, in 2015, there was a study that was done by Food and Water Watch that compared that looked at the 500 largest water systems in the country and compared how much households were paying. And what they found was that, you can see in this chart here, that for systems that were under public ownership, there were, the average annual bill was around $315, whereas under private ownership, it was around $500. So there's a big difference between the rates of public ownership and private ownership, in the water sector, but we also see this in other areas of infrastructure as well.
And one thing I'll add as well, because I talk a lot about infrastructure around the country and journalists, we need to remember that there's really, we have needs, things cost money, and there's only one source of that money. So for water system, there's only one source to fund our physical infrastructure, us, taxes, tolls, and fees. And so that's really important to understand as you get into the argument, into the discussions about P3s and efficiency and and stuff like that. It's an important point to remember. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think the last big question is, and again, this is kind of a little cheeky, but it's if a private company thinks they can make money, why can't we? And what we're, so private sector says, we can do it cheaper, we can do it better, we can do it faster. But there are corners that are often cut to increase margins. So whether that's through cutting labor costs, like we just talked about in a previous slide, using inferior materials, using, skimping on inputs that have to do with the quality of the service. And so what we advocate all the time for is the need for a rigorous full cost analysis to compare public and private provision. So you need to understand where the cost savings are deriving from under a privatization scheme. And are you comfortable with where those savings are, come from? Need to ensure that the analysis takes into consideration things like transition costs, shifted costs, contract administration costs. These are real costs that the government incurs and need to be, under privatization. So it needs to be included in any sort of cost analysis. Need to ensure that future projections are not too rosy. This is a problem that we've seen a lot in the infrastructure world. And then need to consider life cycle costs and issues. So let me give a concrete example to make this clear. With public-private partnerships, or P3s, there is a tool that's often used called a value for money analysis. And this is a tool that compares the life cycle costs of a traditional procurement approach versus a P3 approach. We have analyzed a number of these, and one of the projects that we were involved in and analyzed these projections was the Miami Heights water proposed P3. So this was the Miami-Dade area needed a new water treatment plant. So that's what this was about. And at the end of the document, it shows that the P3 option could be up to $22 million cheaper. So you'll see on the screen that DBFOM, that's your P3 option. So private entity is going to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain the entire asset. And then the other two, the DB and the DBB, those are our traditional procurement approaches where we're using the municipal bond market for our financing. But how did we get there? How did the analysis get to saying that privatization P3 is the way to go? And so they quantified the cost of the project, the life cycle cost, they quantified the financing costs. And at that point, the traditional procurement methods were actually a lot cheaper. So the P3 option was actually $25 million more expensive when compared to the other options. I'm sorry, do you mind going back to the previous slide? And so what's interesting is then what these analyses do is they take risk, like construction delays or equipment failures or increased operating costs. And they basically assume that the private sector can do these things better. And they say, therefore, it's the less risky option. And we're going to assign monetary value to that. And so once they do this kind of, risk transfer analysis, that's when they say, voila, the P3 option is actually cheaper than the traditional procurement approach option. So it's much more an art than a science. And what's really interesting is that the Ontario is so Canada has done a lot more P3 projects than the US has. And Ontario is the province that has done the most P3 projects. They did a few years ago, they released an audit where they went through 75 P3 projects that they had done. And what they found was that the value for money analysis predicted in all the cases that the traditional delivery methods would be more risky and more expensive when compared to the P3 model. But they were wrong. In 74 out of the 75 projects, what they found was that they were more expensive, and especially when compared to what they had estimated for the traditional delivery method. And there's a few things that are particularly interesting. They say that there's no empirical data supporting the key assumptions used by the infrastructure agency to assign costs to specific risks. And that often the delivery of projects by the public sector was cast in a negative light, resulting in significant differences in the assumptions used to value risks between the public sector and the P3 approach. So I think what this is saying is that at the bottom line, all of this is look very carefully at the financial analyses underlying these projects. Unfortunately, because these are documents that have lots of numbers in them, a lot of public officials kind of take them as gospel and then say, look, P3 is the way to go. We need to use a privatization approach. But there's, more art than science, and really ask the hard questions around these analyses. And I'll just, if you take it, I wanted to point out one little thing. If you take a little closer look at this, this is the same analysis that we looked at. You'll see there's a line item for labor, and you can see that it says the P3 approach, it's going to be cheaper than, labor will be cheaper than either of the traditional approaches. And they say it's because we're going to need to use less staffing if we use a P3 approach. There's no justification of why they need less staffing. There's no information, but again, it's a way to make the P3 look like a better deal. So just kind of be on the lookout for those types of things when you're looking at some of these underlying documents.
Yeah, and we're going to move into the, right, so I'm going to make a point about that takes us into the next piece as well. So, I mean, that's the value for money and the stuff that Cher was just talking about gets a little bit in the weeds, and we spend some time in there. We believe that a good value for money analysis should start with those things we value, right? So if we value good jobs, if we value jobs for into construction for formerly incarcerated people, if we value other ESG or environmental standards, we should be able to include them in, because we might be willing to spend more money on some of those things, but we should be really clear that it shouldn't be just a sort of a nuts and bolts cost analysis of how cheap can you do it without the right values driving that analysis. So I'm going to go it's a few more slides pretty quickly, and then to kind of lead towards opener discussion about some of the responses and the issues for investors. So why don't you move to the next slide, Andrea. So first, and some of you may have been involved, investors and pension funds and others have been working to back away from the prison REITs, the prison, CCA and GEO principally. And we were, and maybe other people on the call were part of kind of a large effort to try to encourage the banks that are funding those REITs to withdraw their financing, and had enormous impact so far that these banks listed on the screen have publicly said they will stop their financing relationships with GEO and CoreCivic, at a great deal of funding. What's significant about that is because they are REITs, two things. They need the capital for growth, obviously, and for new construction or acquisition of new companies, which they're doing a lot of, both in other, the ankle bracelets and other parts of the criminal justice system. But because they're a REIT and most of, the vast majority of their money has to be distributed to shareholders on a regular basis, they actually have cash flow needs. They actually have short-term debt needs. So, and there was so that's number one. And then you saw, some of you may know also CalSTRS, the teachers' retirement in California in 18 divested from Geo Group and Core Civic. In 19, CalPERS, the biggest public pension fund in the country, also divested. There are other colleges, and some of this is, a lot of this is coming from activism of on the campuses from students and others. So that's one way. I think it's a real clear way we have a sense of how to engage, how folks are engaging in using their investor influence. Go ahead. So the other way is to influence. I mean, again, with private prisons, we think, we don't like them, but we want water systems. We want to build infrastructure. We want to deliver on public goods. So a couple of examples I'll mention, and we would love more to hear from you, either here or as we open it up or later. So just a couple of examples. Rialto Water System, which is in California, about 50, 70 miles east of Los Angeles, is a P3, a public-private partnership that was financed in great part they're all partnerships, but a leading partner was Ulico, which is a union-based insurance investment fund. And they have some of the best responsible contracting standards as part of their investment portfolio, part of their investment standards of any. So I'll get to that question in a second. And so, there'll be built union, there'll be operated union with good jobs and other things. And so we really think, that encourage others to look at. I haven't looked at it in a few years, but they have really good standards. So not only did they privatize it, but they did privatize it, but they privatized it in a way that ensured that there still would be high quality, good middle-class jobs. Similarly, in the Miami tunnel, it's a free tunnel, came in under, on time, under budget. People like it. We haven't analyzed the finances that much because people have raised questions about that, but it's a very popular program in Miami for two reasons. One is that it's free and came in on time, but also because it had a very substantial local hire program that was developed in partnership with the Laborers International Union, and for the construction of the tunnel, and very popular. It was it was a partnership between LAUNA, the Laborers Union, and AECOM, which is one of the bigger developers, but it was sort of part of the deal as it was conceptualized and it was put forward. So examples, and we have some other examples, but could certainly use more examples where not just job quality standards were made part of the investor requirements or investor standards, but also environmental, also community-based needs. So it does happen, and there are lots of, and we would like to know about more. Go ahead. So just I think this might even be the last slide, right? No, almost the last slide. Sort of the issues to it for investors to consider is that just kind of come up all the time. And there's not a right answer. Like I said about charter schools, are you for them or against them? We give talks about, P3s and public-private partnerships and infrastructure. And we're always telling the bad stories and what to look out for. And people say, but aren't you in favor of them? And the same question we get is, what's a good P3 and what's a bad P3, for example? And it's also not a good question because it's all about the features. There's choices and trade-offs in every one. So some of the issues we see are a substantial power imbalance between public agency and private investors. Chicago was a parking meter was a perfect example there. One of the things that Cher didn't mention is after that vote to do that happened within days of announcing a proposal. So the analysis was done after the fact. And even though it's incredibly, what I believe, dumb way to borrow money on your future, parking meter revenues, even if they were desperate and there was no other choices, they sold $1 billion too cheaply. They could have got $1 billion if they just had better negotiators. So there's this power imbalance that comes up in lots of different examples and cases. Then, of course, there's the tension between the more expensive cost of capital versus public capital is much cheaper, and embedding standards. Things cost money. You want to do job training programs, those cost money. You want to do environmental standards, they may cost money. So there's a constant tension in all private, in every kind of sector that we deal with. The third issue is how do investors get enough influence? I mean, we're not investors, but have worked with pension funds and others to set the terms of an investment. And it's something we think about. Is Ulico was able to do Rialto because they had enough skin in, they had enough capital in the game, in the project, to be able to set the terms. But often, investors don't have that much. So, are there ways that investors could collaborate to get enough capital together to do that? And then others, are there novel deal structures? There's debt financing and there's equity financing. I've advocated in some cases that in cases where we need the thing, the bridge, or in Miami, there's a courthouse that's fallen apart and they need to build it. They couldn't raise the money through taxes. They put it on the ballot and failed, for example. So why not? But we need it desperately. Why not pay the extra cost of capital, but don't privatize it. Don't give them control over 30 or 40 or 50 years because other things happen that way. And that would be a DBF, design, build, finance, or a DF, design or a build finance. There's different models. And obviously the cost of capital makes a big difference here. So patient capital can play a much patient, capital where you're really thinking about these kinds of investments as part of your income part of your portfolio as opposed to your equity or growth parts of portfolio could make a big difference. So if you want to set yourself apart, the last piece here as an investor, we urge that, we think that you can do meaningful engagement with community as a way to stand out because these procurement processes are all competitive, and including community and worker benefit standards and doing community benefit programs and adding some of the things that we call infrastructure justice. In other words, pathways for formerly incarcerated into jobs, or women in construction or manufacturing. Making those part of the deal at the front end has they're good things to do, but they also can be a political advantage in many ways, in many places, and we've seen lots of examples of that as well. And it's sort of a way to guarantee that you are really considering public goods and public benefit is by actually involving the public and what their needs in the communities that are being invested in. So I'm going to pass it to you, Andrea, I think, for the next slide. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to address Sarah's question, or we can all take it in turns around. Yes. So Sarah's, I guess everyone can see Sarah's question. Should investors be putting money into municipal bonds rather than these companies doing P3 contracts? I believe so, actually. It's, let me say it in the following way. Municipal bonds are cheaper, they're more flexible, and they're public entirely. And so I think, they have to, so I think, the reason for private investor interest is because there's limits on municipal bond, the letting of municipal bonds that are often political, right? In the water rate case, in the water rates that Cher talked about, it may very well be that that people are paying too little because they didn't, because the people who are in control of raising rates, the city council, whatever, just didn't do it adequately to keep the system in good shape. So it would be far cheaper and better to do municipal, but the private sector comes in and says, we can do it cheaper, we can do it better, faster, and all that sort of stuff. And they do the money, and then they raise the rates. So they think they're outsourcing that pain of raising the rates because things cost money. So anyway, let me leave it at that. Another point, but all right. So how do you want to go forward, Andrea? So we'll also address Chet's question in a second. Thanks, Chet. I will pass it on to Sharon Donald, who are more likely to know. So I just want to bring up some considerations and ideally bring in some of our participants also to look at what you have seen or what you're seeing as your potential role in this, in ensuring that where private capital is needed in a privatization context, it actually doesn't run afoul of the issues that Sharon Donald have raised with us. In terms of a first step for folks allocating capital, I imagine first doing a review of the exposure that there might be to good or bad privatization would be a good start, and certainly looking from the 10 questions that are included in that document and turning it almost into a due diligence step whenever the potential of privatization is involved. From an asset class perspective, I think picking up on what Sarah was saying about muni bonds, there's been some great work on the part of activists from Frontline Solutions to look even within muni bonds. Again, it's some of those covenants around quality jobs, who the jobs go to, racial equity in the use of those funds. I imagine in the public equity space there might be some room for advocacy, similarly to how we see in other areas. Starting from something as simple as sort of engagement and resolution, but also not also pushing for a more equitable approach to this privatization, where there are power dynamics, as we heard about before, right? Just because you own a piece of a company that could be exploitative towards the public sector doesn't necessarily mean that the right thing to do is to exploit every potential increase in the budget or otherwise. Now, that is not going to go very far with a lot of investors, unfortunately. However, I think there was something very interesting that you brought up earlier with respect to almost a business case for investors to have more equitable privatization practices around, say, if you are a local public pension fund, right, your municipality at large will suffer from bad privatization in a way that holistically ultimately ends up biting you back, right? You would overall, let's say, the New York City Public Employees Pension Fund and the employees that it's aiming to serve would do better if those employees still had quality jobs, right? If the jobs were not lost or scrapped or outsourced or otherwise. Definitely in the sort of alternatives space, private equity, I love the idea of leaning more towards debt than equity, or breaking down, separating out a little bit the ownership, as in the residual economic interest piece, from the governance aspect, and making sure that the governance rights that come with an investment of this sort are commensurate with the risk that you're taking, are not just seeking to domineer in general. So in terms of the different roles, I wanted to sort of bring it up and see if anyone who is on the line, if they are, from a pension fund perspective, religious institution, family office, or foundation, might see a space for them to operate in. With that, as people chime in, I will bring up two more questions. One that came in from Lee around, are there any thoughts on transparency and public legislative input at the deal-making stage? Are there, say, any reasonable standards around proprietary information? And then a question from Chet on who is doing good work to address the privatization of the wireless broadband spectrum through FCC auctions. And I will turn those over to you, Shar and Donald.
Sure, why don't you take Lee's question first? You're on mute. Well, yeah, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Yeah, so I think that I think, yeah, there are definitely transparency, public and legislative input at the deal making stage is incredibly important. And, you know, unfortunately, what we see in a lot of these deals is that during the procurement and the deal making stage, there isn't a lot of transparency, the public isn't involved, and the legislative input is kind of a rubber stamp or, you know, or a check the box, and they don't have, as Donald said, there's been a lot of instances where they don't have adequate time to actually review something before voting on it. So I think those are issues that are definitely on our radar, and that are part of the bigger issues with privatization, and part of the bigger issues around process, yeah, I mean, I think those are really important considerations.
So one of the reasons we do these documents of questions, and this is the simplest questions document we have much more detailed ones for different sectors, including infrastructure and others, is because that, you know, legislators and decision makers and the public need to know what questions to ask to drill in, because, you know, they're complicated deals. So that's why we do that. On the part about proprietary information standards, you know, we hear, you know, trades and people try to get information, you know, submitting open records requests or what have you in all sorts of circumstances. In some cases, it makes sense. You need a private process to, you know, to be able to negotiate. In other cases, there really may very well be a trade secret. But what we see a lot is that a company will say, whether they're doing whether it's a purchasing, you know, a contract for goods, for actual procurement, or whether it's a P3, is they will say to the agency, if when asked for certain information, they will claim it's a trade secret, and the agency will often say, I guess so, right, and agree. And so we were involved a little bit in a year or two back in what's called a reverse public records request, where a local group that we work with asked for information about a contract based on, you know, about the standards that the contract were given on. The company filed a lawsuit against the agency saying, don't give them the information, that's a trade secret. Ultimately, the advocacy group won in the courts. It took 2-3 years with a lot of costs. So that's a really important point. On the wire, I don't think I know anybody on the wireless broadband, you know, the issues. I mean, occasionally what comes up to us is, you know, people want to do municipal broadband. I think they call it, what do they call it? Democracy Collaborative is doing some work on that, but we're happy to look and would like to know, because it's a real fundamental issue on the broadband spectrum. We're just not in our space. What's you copied a question from Hannah or Gary? I don't understand. Read the question.
Sure, there are a couple of questions here that were put in the question box. So one of them is, do you know of any examples of public-private partnerships that define socially equitable outcomes and benchmarks?
Share. Mute.
So I don't. And Donald, you correct me if I'm missing something. What I will say is that there have been some, and again, these are not public-private partnerships, but there have been some development deals that have had like community benefits agreements that have defined kind of socially equitable outcomes and benchmarks and been very specific about that. We wrote a report a few years back where, and the name of it is escaping me right now, but we can definitely, if you're interested, make sure that you get it. But we basically looked at a number of these community benefits. Thank you, Donald. It's on the chat box now. We looked at these community benefits agreements and co-authored this with a group that does a lot of community benefits agreements as part of their work, and then talked about how that could look in a P3 context. So we were very interested in this topic, but I am not aware of a P3 that has actually gone so far to actually define socially equitable outcomes and benchmarks. Is that right, Donald?
Yeah, I was getting up here. I don't think so. I mean, there are a lot of them, and it's all, you know, it's all in the weeds, and you have to look at them. So it's possible. It's actually something we would like to do. You know, a couple of years ago, we thought we would like to. It's a bandwidth issue for us, but create what we called a, you know, sort of ESG value for money analysis. What are the things we value, and how would you measure against that? So there may be some things out there, but I don't. The fundamental dynamic is around cost. Now, there may be features in some of these deals that we talked about, you know, that, you know, it's got a local hire agreement or it's, you know, things like that. But I think defining that would be a valuable project.
Yeah, I love that idea. And Hannah, if you want to follow up with any of us, and we could give it a little bit of thought as to how it would be. And I imagine we could start by pulling together some of the social equitable benchmarks that already exist in other areas and see how they would need to be tweaked for the PPP context. So.
Yeah, we would love to help. That would be great for you all to do. Absolutely. Yeah.
And one question from this person that came in separately is whether these consequences of privatization that you brought up and analyzed tend to impact communities of color more often than not. And an intuitive level, that seems like it might be the case, at least as a regressive kind of tax. At least if we look at some lower income populations in communities of color. Do you have any sense of that? Have you looked into the issue of the kind of racial equity implications of these privatizations?
Yeah, go ahead, share, because I know what you're going to say. Oh, you turned your community on, yeah.
Okay, there we go. So yes, short answer, yes. I think that one thing that I want to point out, because there's a lot more detail in that report than I can remember at this point, is we did a report a few years back on how privatization increases inequality, and there was a number of examples where there was a distinct kind of race lens in a lot of the sectors, and so. That we definitely did find in a number of areas that there was impact and disproportionate impact in some areas like transit, water, and then who's losing their jobs or getting jobs degraded that were that impacted communities of color.
Yeah. All right, hold on. Let me just. I mean, the water example. I mean, is a good one. I mean, because what happened? I mean, Coatesville, Pennsylvania. The water system got privatized. Rates went up. Maybe they needed more money for the system, but rates went up. People went bankrupt, and this is a poor community with with a sort of obvious with a large concentration of African Americans or people of color. So that's one of the things is when you go to when the payment, let me think about this. One thing I wanted to say earlier is on this issue of muni bonds and all that is, and I said this to a group at the TLF in Boston a couple of years ago, and it seemed to make sense to them. The borrowing the money is the easy part. It's the paying it back. And it's the hard part. And like I said earlier, taxes, tolls, and fees, there's only one source to pay it back. So the more we rely on individual payment, the more impact you will have on people who don't have the resources to pay. Flint, it's not a privatization issue per se, although there was a private company involved. They can't fix their own water system. So if a private company wanted to come in and take over their water system, and the rates had to pay for it, there's no way it could happen, whether public or private. So that's important thing to think about.
I'll just add that in the transit space, there's been a number of examples where a private company comes in, takes over the transit system, needs to cut lines in order to you know, make their numbers work. And the first lines to go are ones that go into communities of color, which in the cases that we've looked at were, you know, a lot of those folks relied on the bus service to get to work, to get to school. So the short answer is yes, but it looks a little bit different depending on what sector we're looking at.
Yeah, you know, I'll add one other thing. This is, again, all right, infrastructure, but could be broader. That's what's in my head. Is so the public-private partnerships always have public money in them. It's, you know, so private investor comes in and says, we can help, you know, build this, you know, bridge that you need, and a package is put together, and there's public money and private money, and so I don't think we have examples. Maybe Sherry, you do, but where public money will be driven, limited public money driven to profitable projects. When there may be greater need in urban communities that are not, quote, profitable, where the resources aren't there to pay it back, where investors don't want to invest. So we worry about that. We haven't looked at it in great detail, that, you know, private investors will drive the priority system of what gets built. That could be an issue. In the same vein. Did we miss a question, Andrea? You said there's one that says, are there financial calculations that consider the cost of public goods? Does that, I'm not sure how to answer that. Did you raise that one already?
No, I thought you were touching on it when you were talking about that, the sort of ESG.
Okay. Got it.
Calculation, yeah.
And can I actually add one more thing to that particular, this was Hannah's question around the socially equitable outcomes and benchmarks and P3s. One thought, just one other thing that I wanted to say was that, and this is kind of tangentially related, but I think an important point to make is that one thing that we see in a lot of these procurements for P3s is that the public entity is very concerned about not getting enough interest from the investor community in their P3s. And so they're very hesitant to put any sort of, standards or, socially equitable outcomes or anything like that in their procurement documents. Because the place where you would want this, in an ideal world, the place where you would want to see this is, the very first procurement. You'd want this to be embedded in an RFP way before you ever got to the contract stage. And what we have heard and what we have seen is that, governments are very concerned about not getting enough interest from investors. And so they try to make it kind of as, their procurement documents kind of as loosey-goosey as possible in order to attract more interest. And so there's kind of that, I just want to point out that there's that dynamic working as well, which is why the public side, the government side is not pushing this stuff either in a lot of cases.
So that seems like a great opportunity for an investor that cares about this to actually signal to the contrary, right? That their demand will be contingent on there being some sort of guardrails around the type of issuance. Interesting. And the last thing that will add then in terms of the investor roles, which has come up a few times, is going back to Donald's earlier point about ask the public, whatever the public is, right? It might be the community itself. In terms of what are the standards that oftentimes don't even make it up to the investor decision-making level, whether it's around charter schools, right? What are the concerns with that, or with equitable infrastructure? We certainly saw it recently in the context of alternatives to incarceration, where many investors were keen to play a role in that, right, as seeing it as a more humane option than incarceration itself. but running counter to some of the movement and the criminal justice reform activists' own initiatives in a way that can almost take the wind out of their sails. So I would say, as investors, we should make sure that we are kind of coordinating with those that are on the front lines of the specific issue, who might both have information that would be useful to inform a position, and they might also already have some activity going on that we would not want to, expropriate or privatize in that way. I saw that there was a question from Amy. Bigger issues. Okay, so she says, yeah, is the bigger issue here the neoliberal attack on government that has convinced us that government is incompetent and that taxes are minimized? And thank you, Donald, for putting that link there. But I will add one thought that came up in our prep calls for this webinar, where I was saying that in some ways there is even more of a danger in terms, as Amy puts it, of the neoliberal attack on government, when privatization and public-private partnerships actually go well, right? Because if you have an intervention that is predicated on the government not having done a certain action or not having done well, private sector comes in and you have better results. It actually works out. It's on time, under budget, and the like. It almost feeds that narrative of, oh, you see, the private sector can do it better. Why don't you just leave it to the private sector? So that's one thing that I personally continue to wrestle with, right? If interventions, even from well-meaning impact investors, end up feeding this notion that the government is incompetent, as opposed to being a halfway step while we also try to strengthen the government's ability to respond to particular issues.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Amy, to the response that I gave, I don't know if everybody sees it, was in the Q&A box. I can put it in the other one. Is a booklet that I wrote, sort of my analysis of the sort of attack on government that you refer to and things we need to think about. And you can feel free to follow up if that's of interest. But I think there really is this larger question that we address in our work. Thanks. It's sort of the difference between public and private, right? All of the, I mean, in P3s, the roads get built, the water system gets built, we need that stuff. The question in our mind, and in charter schools, the schools happen, in the Pay for Success, even the ones we don't like, the intervention actually happens. Good things happen. What we think about is sort of what's the public role and what's the private role, and how do we manage that in a way that we're not weakening, the ideal of public goods and public responsibility, and that we're not giving private control over things that ought to be within the public domain as a fundamental public decision. So, that's how we think about all the work that we do.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I think we did manage to cover a lot. So I would like to thank you, Shar and Donald, for all the work that you do and for sharing it with us and helping us think a bit through the investor's role in and investor relevant considerations around privatization. Here are the contacts on the slide, or I can pass them along to you separately if you would like to follow up with Shar and Donald. And I think a couple of actionable next steps came up that we should all probably start thinking about, subject to the usual bandwidth constraints that I am more than sympathetic to. So, Shar, Donald, thank you so much for joining us today. We learned a lot. We're glad to see all the resources and all the work that you have done. And thanks to all the participants that joined us today. You will also receive the recording if you want to follow up. And if you want to learn more about the work of the Transform Finance Investor Network, please reach out to us. So thank you all, and we'll reconvene after the holidays. So happy holidays, and we will see you in January.